The annual Choirs Festival of Flaxborough, if not quite the cultural summit of the county, was nonetheless treated locally with the hushed awe of an event whose seriousness must not be openly mocked. It had, after all, endured for 63 years, and in that time had managed to survive not only the Second World War, but also a decade of Baroque innovation attempted by the former organist of St. Saviour's, who had believed plainchant benefited from percussion accompaniment. By comparison, this year's gathering promised a tranquil predictability. The children of St. Luke's were to sing "All Things Bright and Beautiful" in voices of piercing sincerity, while a nervous baritone from the Methodist mission would attempt "Abide with Me" without the aid of a key he could comfortably recognize. Most of the town's more respectable households were present, seated upright on the unforgiving pews, the older matrons whispering inventories of who had worn last year's hat again. It was into this atmosphere of routine and faint discomfort that the incident intruded. The hymn books had been stacked neatly at the rear of St. Saviour's vestry, a pile so orderly it might have been mistaken for a civic monument. As the opening prayers concluded and the choirmaster raised his baton for the first combined chorus, there came from the vestry an unmistakable crackling sound, followed by a thin ribbon of smoke that curled with theatrical deliberation into the nave. At first, the congregation assumed it a matter of candle wax, or perhaps a malfunctioning censer, though, as one elderly Methodist promptly pointed out, we don't hold with censers. But when a choir boy returned white-faced and whispered to the vicar, the alarm spread with the rapidity of hymnals being shut in mid-stanza. The vicar, Reverend Teal, bustled down the aisle, his gait torn between clerical dignity and secular haste. He flung open the vestry door, revealing in its modest interior a curious sight, a small heap of hymn books smouldering with such quiet determination that several spectators later remarked it looked practiced. A few pages blackened into ash even as Teal, with a vigour more often reserved for condemning modern music, beat at the flames with his cassock sleeve. It was all over in less than a minute. By the time two men returned with buckets of water from the churchyard tap, the fire had already surrendered to the combined efforts of panic and fabric. Still, the damage was plain. Half a dozen charred hymnals, one scorched cassock, and a ripple of scandal running along the pews. The townsfolk, released into the night air after an abrupt dismissal of the proceedings, did what was natural. They began to explain to one another what had really happened. Mrs. Price, who prided herself on never missing a service, insisted it was clearly the fault of careless altar boys and wax matches. Mr. Willoughby, the fishmonger, confided in 3 separate groups that he had seen a shadowy figure slipping out of the vestry just before the smoke appeared, though each retelling altered the figure's height, gender, and speed of exit. Miss Bellamy of the Women's Guild favoured a theory involving electrical faults, although the church had neither the wiring nor, arguably, the budget for such luxuries. By the next morning, the burning of the psalms had already acquired its title, tone, and inevitable air of exaggeration. The town, it seemed, was in possession of an arsonist, and quite possibly a blasphemer. It was, therefore, with the quiet inevitability that marks all Flaxborough scandals, that Inspector Purbright was asked to look into the matter. He received the request while at his desk in the police station, where he had been filling a crossword with deliberate care. When Sergeant Love entered, pink-faced with the news, Purbright merely laid down his pencil and murmured, "Oh? Someone has taken issue with the Almighty's taste in hymnody." Love, eager to appear competent, explained the circumstances with more drama than accuracy. Purbright listened, his mild blue eyes betraying nothing, then sighed gently, as though invited to inspect yet another case of pilfered marrows. "Very well," he said at last, adjusting his spectacles. "I dare say one ought to begin by finding who, among our neighbours, holds so strong an opinion of church music that they felt fire to be the proper instrument of criticism." And with that, Inspector Purbright rose, buttoned his jacket with unhurried precision, and prepared to step once more into the genteel eccentricities of Flaxborough life. The morning after the incident, the market square held a liveliness it usually reserved for cattle auctions or the unveiling of a new parking regulation. Traders who might otherwise have confined their commentary to the weather and the price of butter leaned conspiratorially across stalls to rehearse versions of last night's drama. By the time Mrs. Gammage purchased her haddock from Mr. Willoughby, she was assured, with hand-on-heart conviction, that the arsonist had been a dishevelled stranger glimpsed near the rectory, reeking of petrol and badness. Mrs. Gammage carried this information along with her fish to the drapery shop, where it improved in colour. There the stranger became two men, each with foreign accents, who had been seen scurrying away from St. Saviour's under suspiciously heavy coats. By tea-time, these foreigners had shrunk again into a single figure, this time stout and bearded, who bore a remarkable resemblance to Councillor Grope, though nobody wished to say so too loudly, Councillor Grope being known for both his hearing and his readiness to consult solicitors. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, strolled about the town with the sort of mild attentiveness that left most citizens uncertain whether they were being interviewed or merely nodded at. His inquiries began, inevitably, at St. Saviour's. Reverend Teal met him in the vestry, now tidy again but for the faint scent of scorched paper, and a suspiciously new curtain across the cupboard where the hymn books had been stacked. "I'm relieved you've come, Inspector," Teal said, wringing his hands as if the smoke still clung to them. "It was quite dreadful. God's word in flames, imagine." Purbright peered at the scorched shelf, then at the new curtain. "I dare say the Almighty has survived sterner critics," he remarked mildly. "Still, it must have been disconcerting for the congregation." The vicar sighed. "Disconcerting hardly covers it. Mrs. Price fainted clean into the offertory plate, and Mr. Willoughby, well, I don't think he meant to shout deviltry quite so loudly, but everyone heard." Purbright asked who had last been in the vestry before the smoke began. Teal hesitated. "Well, the boys were fetching hymnals, and Mr. Dainty, the choir master, had been here arranging his music sheets. Perfectly harmless man. Fussy, perhaps, but harmless. Unless—" He broke off with a theatrical shiver, as though the idea of Mr. Dainty harbouring pyromaniac tendencies had only just been born. Purbright inclined his head, but said nothing. He preferred to let people's imaginations build their own traps. Back outside, he found Sergeant Love speaking with a gaggle of parishioners, who had returned to view the crime scene, much as others might linger over a fallen tree or a traffic diversion. They were competing to describe the quantity of smoke, ranging from thick as fog to barely a puff. Love dutifully noted each account, his notebook resembling less an official record than a compendium of local fiction. By afternoon, the affair had reached the snug of the Black Swan public house, where the most authoritative opinions were always brewed. Here the consensus tilted toward conspiracy. The fire was not the work of any choir boy or stranger, but a deliberate message. Against whom and why was still unclear, though theories involving spiritualists, anti-ecclesiastical radicals, and disgruntled bell-ringers were debated with cheerful vigour. Purbright entered quietly, accepted a half-pint he had not ordered, and listened. The talk, when filtered of its froth, yielded only one point of interest. Several townsfolk, independently and without prompting, insisted that they had seen Reverend Teal looking unusually pale before the smoke began. Not just pale with alarm, but pale beforehand, as though he had known what was about to occur. It was not, to Purbright's mind, much of a clue. But the inspector had learned that when a whole town confected the same suspicion, it was seldom without a kernel of something, if not truth, then vanity or resentment. And those in Flaxborough often proved just as revealing. Inspector Purbright began his round of conversations the following day with a degree of patience that, to Sergeant Love, seemed indistinguishable from inactivity. Love had hoped for something rather more dramatic, a summons perhaps, or a brisk inspection of footprints. Instead, Purbright spent most of the morning in the vestry again, contemplating hymnals with the calm of a man comparing library bindings. His first interview was with Mr. Dainty, the choir master. Dainty was a neat man of uncertain middle age whose collar seemed always a size too tight, giving him a perpetually strangled air. He received Purbright in the cramped music room at the back of his semi-detached house, surrounded by yellowing scores and the faint scent of furniture polish. "I can't imagine how it happened," Dainty declared, before the inspector had asked anything at all. "I was only gone a minute. Left my music sheets here. Never would I endanger them by bringing them into a draughty vestry, you know. Paper curls dreadfully." He paused to tap an immaculately aligned stack. "I was most particular. If a boy was playing with matches, I'd have noticed." Purbright nodded and inquired gently whether Mr. Dainty had enemies in the parish. Dainty gave a high laugh. Enemies? Certainly not. Though, well, if you mean those who dislike discipline, there are a few choir parents. They think their children angels whose voices must never be corrected. But that is hardly grounds for arson. He smiled thinly. Or is it? From Dainty, Purbright proceeded to the home of Mrs. Price, whose fainting fit had been discussed as fervently as the fire itself. She lived in a narrow terrace where the curtains had clearly been chosen for their ability to advertise her neatness to the street. She welcomed the inspector with tea and a detailed account of how she had swooned. I felt overcome, Inspector. Not by fear, you understand. I'm not a nervous type, but by the sheer wickedness of it. Burning the Lord's words. It struck me like a physical blow, and as I fell, very gracefully I'm told, I caught sight of a figure at the back of the church. Purbright asked what kind of figure. Mrs. Price frowned. It was a man. I believe so, of medium height, or possibly tall. He wore something dark. Yes, I should say he looked suspicious. Entirely suspicious. The inspector accepted this description gravely, though he noted the ease with which Mrs. Price embroidered her certainty upon the canvas of vagueness. Later that afternoon he spoke with Mr. Willoughby, the fishmonger, whose shadowy figure had already grown famous. Willoughby gave his evidence with relish, as though rehearsing for a trial in which he was both star witness and expert commentator. Slipped out just before the smoke, he did. Not a parishioner. I know everyone who comes regular. This one was different. He lowered his voice. Could have been a stranger. Could it? Murmured Purbright. And what made you think so? Well, he moved quickly, and I couldn't see his face. Purbright thanked him kindly, and Willoughby looked faintly disappointed that his testimony had not been greeted with a trumpet flourish. By evening, the inspector's notebook contained a series of accounts that contradicted one another with such enthusiasm that Sergeant Love was tempted to cross half of them out. Instead, Purbright read them over with serene attention, then placed the notebook carefully into his desk drawer. It would seem, he observed, that our fire attracted more witnesses than smoke, yet none appears to have seen the flame until after it was put out. Love scratched his head. So, you don't think it was an accident, sir? Purbright smiled faintly. My dear Love, I'm not sure we yet know whether it was a fire at all, in the sense of being a deliberate act. But the people of Flaxborough are determined it was, and that conviction, I assure you, will prove more illuminating than a dozen singed hymnals. By the following day the town had arrived at a conclusion. Not an official one, of course, such things required committees and signatures, but a conclusion nonetheless, shaped in back rooms, over grocers' counters, and by the inexorable logic of gossip. The culprit, it seemed, must be Mr. Dainty, the choirmaster. Why him? Nobody could quite say with precision, but several reasons circulated with the persuasive force of repetition. Dainty was a bit too fussy, queer in his ways, and always about the vestry fiddling with papers. A woman from the guild even swore she had once seen him dispose of a whole stack of hymn sheets into a dustbin without ceremony, which to her mind marked him as someone well capable of arson, or worse. Inspector Purbright listened to these verdicts with his customary serenity. He made no protest when Councillor Grope, appearing at the police station in his usual state of civic indignation, insisted that a full investigation into the choirmaster's character was required for the dignity of the borough. Nor did he argue when Reverend Teal, though visibly uneasy, admitted that Mr. Dainty's rather sharp criticisms of certain hymns might have betrayed a more dangerous discontent than previously suspected. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, relished the air of purpose. "Shall I bring him in for questioning, sir?" he asked, his pencil hovering. "By all means, speak to him again," Purbright replied mildly, "but perhaps without the air of arrest. People are often more helpful before they are given the dignity of being suspects." Love, uncertain whether this was meant as advice or philosophy, went about his errand with enthusiasm. Dainty, found re-gluing the spines of his sheet music, received the sergeant with wounded dignity. "I suppose you've come to ask whether I set fire to my own hymnals," he said tartly, "or to the Almighty's, which amounts to the same thing." Love shuffled. "Well, You were the last in the vestry, sir. People say—" "People," Dainty interrupted, "say what they please. It has always been so, especially in Flaxborough. Let me tell you, Sergeant, if I had wished to commit arson, I should have chosen a target of greater musical offence than the psalms. At least they scan properly." Love, struggling to keep pace with the remark, scribbled in his notebook and departed, convinced that Dainty's sharp tongue was another mark against him. When Love presented his notes later, Purbright studied them without comment. At length he murmured, "So the town wishes to blame the choir master. It will comfort them for the moment." "You don't think it was him, sir?" Purbright replaced his spectacles on the bridge of his nose. "My dear Love, if one is ever tempted to accept the simplest explanation in Flaxborough, it is always wise to remember how very industrious this town is at manufacturing simplicity. It often requires more labour than the truth itself." And with that, the inspector resumed his quiet perusal of a parish directory, his finger pausing thoughtfully upon names that seemed, at first glance, entirely irrelevant. The next morning was bright, with that watery sunshine Flaxborough habitually mistook for spring. Inspector Purbright, strolling without hurry along the high street, might have appeared to be idling. In reality, he was replaying in his mind a single, rather curious observation that had been mentioned almost by accident the previous day. It came from young Tom Gamage, one of the choir boys, who, when pressed between his mother's insistence that he tell the nice policeman everything, had let slip that the hymn books had not been stacked as usual before the festival. They were all the wrong way round, he had said, shifting under his mother's watchful glare. The backs against the wall instead of the fronts. Mr. Dainty never lets us leave them like that. Mrs. Gamage promptly hushed him, suggesting he must be confused, but the boy had insisted, with that indignant certainty only the young possess, that he knew very well how hymn books were kept. It was not, on the face of it, a matter of consequence. Yet to Purbright it possessed a quiet intrigue. Someone had altered the pile. Someone who either knew, or wished it to appear, that disorder had crept into Dainty's tidy kingdom. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited the vestry again, unaccompanied. The faint smell of char lingered still, as though the walls had decided to hold on to scandal. He examined the cupboard and shelves without touching anything. Nothing stood out. Nothing save the fact that, in a corner, there lay a small stub of wax match, burnt almost to nothing. He bent carefully, nudged it with his pencil, and regarded it with the same mild interest one might afford a dropped toffee wrapper. That match might, of course, have been left there by any boy on any Sunday. But then again, it might not. As he straightened, he noticed another detail, less tangible but curiously telling. The curtain that now covered the cupboard had been hastily tacked up with shiny brass pins. They were new, bright in contrast to the rest of the vestry fittings. Someone, it seemed, had gone out of their way to cover the site of the damage rather than repair it properly. A practical act, yes, but perhaps also one that betrayed anxiety to hide. When Purbright later mentioned this to Sergeant Love, the younger man was puzzled. "But a curtain's just a curtain, sir. Wouldn't most folk want to cover up scorch marks?" "Indeed," Purbright said, "which makes it difficult to argue with. Difficult, but not impossible." Love frowned unconvinced, but Purbright merely smiled faintly and returned to his paperwork. By evening, as the town grew noisy with speculation over the choirmaster's alleged guilt, the inspector sat at his desk and quietly underlined in his notes 3 small items: hymnals reversed, stray match, curtain pinned in haste. Each, on its own, was no more than a trifle. Together, however, they hummed with the faint promise of significance. Flaxborough was never short of grievances. Inspector Purbright knew this, and he also knew that whenever a small scandal presented itself, grievances, usually kept folded away like old bills in a drawer, would be shaken out and displayed as evidence of guilt. The fire in St. Saviour's was proving no exception. By midweek several names, other than poor Mr. Dainty's, had been offered up with the kind of civic generosity that allowed a town to feel helpful while quietly settling scores. Mrs. Willoughby, for instance, leaned across her fishmonger's stall to confide that Mrs. Price herself had been seen more than once in a state of righteous indignation over certain hymns being left out of recent services. She said they favoured the Methodists too much, and I've heard it said, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, that she has matches in every room, every room. Not to be outdone, Mrs. Price returned fire, so to speak, by informing her neighbour that Reverend Teal had lately been under unusual strain. "There's something about him," she told anyone prepared to listen. "White as chalk he looked, even before those books caught. And you know how he gets about money matters. Always anxious, always pleading poverty. Perhaps he hoped to claim some sort of insurance?" Meanwhile, the bell ringers of St. Saviour's, who had always considered themselves the unsung backbone of the parish, were eager to point suspicion elsewhere. According to them, one Mr. Brimley, the organ tuner, was not only careless with wax tapers, but had once muttered loudly that he would rather the whole choir were put to the torch than sing another verse of "Onward, Christian Soldiers." Inspector Purbright received these expanding lists of candidates with his customary calm, quietly filling his notebook with names and remarks while giving no sign of preference. One afternoon he stopped at the vicarage, where Reverend Teal greeted him with a nervous hospitality. The drawing-room smelled faintly of scorched cassock wool. Teal was polite, but his wife, thin, brisk and sharp-eyed, took the opportunity to voice her grievances with considerable force. "This parish, Inspector, is riddled with troublemakers. Only last month the choir fund went mysteriously short of £6. And who had access? Why, half the guild, that's who. I don't say they'd burn hymnals, but it shows the sort of dishonesty one is up against." Her husband attempted a smile. "My dear, perhaps—" "Don't you, my dear me, Alfred," she snapped. "You know perfectly well that ever since that business with the hall heating, people have been whispering, she turned to Purbright. "You'd think, wouldn't you, that good church people would know better than to gossip. Yet here we are." Purbright murmured that he did indeed think so, and left the vicarage with the distinct impression that the Reverend's anxieties owed as much to his spouse as to his congregation. By the end of the week, the inspector's field, as he called it to Sergeant Love, had widened considerably. Love, scanning the list, frowned. So it could be the choirmaster, or Mrs. Price, or the vicar, or his wife, or the bell ringers, or the organ tuner. That doesn't narrow things down much, does it, sir? "No," Purbright agreed pleasantly. "But it does tell us one useful thing. This was not a crime committed in solitude. Even if the act itself was solitary, the motive, when we uncover it, will belong to the parish entire." Love blinked. "The whole parish, sir?" "In a manner of speaking," Purbright said, closing his notebook. "I dare say the smoke has settled on more consciences than one." The second incident arrived with the inconvenient neatness of something staged, though of course Inspector Purbright made no such suggestion. He merely listened, as was his habit, while Sergeant Love, agitated and a little triumphant, recounted the discovery. It was on a Thursday evening, just as the vergers had begun locking the doors of St. Saviour's, that a peculiar smell was noticed drifting from the balcony near the organ loft. At first it was taken for candle grease, or perhaps the lingering aroma of the cleaner's polish. But when Mr. Brimley, the organ tuner, climbed the narrow stair to investigate, he found a folded sheaf of psalm sheets, their edges singed and brittle, tucked beneath the cushions of the loft pew. The faint smoke still curled from them, though no flame remained. This time no swift cassock sleeve had smothered the offence. The papers had burned themselves to the point of collapse, and then expired in silence. Still, the symbolism was not lost on anyone. The priest who burned psalms, as Flaxborough's more melodramatic tongues had already christened the villain, had struck again. By morning, the town's gossip required no prompting. Dainty's guilt was now pronounced in tones of certainty. Who else, after all, had access to the organ loft? Who else was given to dramatic gestures in pursuit of musical purity? Purbright, however, did not hasten to join the chorus. He visited the loft himself, ducking his tall frame beneath the beams, and examined the remains with mild interest. The singed papers were clearly torn from an old psalter, one that had, curiously, gone missing from the vestry cupboard after the first incident. He traced a fingertip along the soot mark on the pew cushion. "Odd," he murmured. Sergeant Love, notebook poised, waited for enlightenment. "Odd, sir?" Purbright tapped the wood of the pew. The cushion has been scorched at the very edge, yet the paper was folded carefully beneath it. One would expect greater damage if the flame had been left untended, almost as if someone meant for it to be noticed, but not to spread. Love frowned. So, deliberate, but careful? Deliberate, certainly. Careful, perhaps, less so. The inspector stood a long while gazing over the empty church, the nave lit only by what little daylight the high windows permitted. He seemed to be listening, not for voices, but for the silence that followed them. Later that day he paid another visit to Reverend Teal. The vicar, pale once more, insisted that the devil was afoot in Flaxborough. "It is persecution, Inspector, pure and simple. Someone wishes to mock the Lord." His wife, however, gave a rather different emphasis. "Someone," she said firmly, "wishes to mock my husband." She folded her arms with the air of a woman who could name names if only it were considered polite. Purbright thanked them both and made no comment. He preferred, at such moments, to let the truth ferment in silence rather than be pressed too soon. Outside, Sergeant Love whispered, "It does look worse for Dainty, though, doesn't it? Twice now. Both times to do with hymnals and psalms." Purbright's reply was a gentle smile. "Perhaps. But consider, Love, if a man wished to hide his guilt, would he commit the same crime again in the same church in the same week?" Love pondered. "I suppose, unless he was daft, sir." "Or," said Purbright quietly, "unless he wished to look daft." And with that the inspector led the way back down the church steps, leaving behind a puzzled sergeant and an increasingly nervous parish. Inspector Purbright had a way of appearing idle when in fact his thoughts were as busy as a whole committee of borough councillors. That weekend, with the town still fizzing from the second incident, he took no conspicuous action. Instead, he was seen by several citizens sitting quite peaceably on a bench beside the duck pond, feeding crumbs to birds with the absent air of a man who had mislaid his shopping list. In truth, he was turning over in his mind what the little fires had revealed, not of the hymn books, but of the people around them. It was never the flames themselves that interested him. Fires were accidents as often as they were intentions. What mattered was how people behaved once the smoke began, who fainted, who shouted, who quietly concealed something, and who rushed to provide explanations before they were asked. In Flaxborough, people's dignity was their most combustible possession, and often it caught light more quickly than paper. Dainty, for example, had bristled too readily, too defensively. His insistence that he could not possibly be guilty might be the plea of an innocent, or the strategy of a man who knew perfectly well that his pedantry had long irritated his parishioners, making him a convenient scapegoat. Mrs. Price, by contrast, seemed to enjoy her swooned celebrity too much. She had embroidered her account until it was no longer an account at all, but a performance. What sort of truth, Purbright wondered, could be extracted from a woman who would never willingly be seen as ordinary? Then there was Reverend Teal, pale with a nervousness that went beyond the misfortune of smouldering hymnals. Purbright recalled the quick glance between him and his wife, and her sharp insistence that the affair was meant to mock her husband. It was not the words themselves that lingered in Purbright's mind, but the undertone of possession and rivalry in her voice. As the inspector fed another crumb to an ungrateful duck, he reflected on Flaxborough's peculiar ecology. It was a town whose surface, neat gardens, polished shop windows, orderly Sunday services, concealed an undergrowth of old envies and bruised pride. A misplaced hymn, a careless remark, a debt unpaid at the church bazaar. Such things might smoulder unseen for years until one evening smoke curled unexpectedly into the nave. He did not yet know whose grievance had taken physical form in fire. But he felt certain of this. The burning of psalms had very little to do with theology and everything to do with human nature. Someone, somewhere among the parish, had found flame the only speech left to them. Purbright rose at last, brushed crumbs from his trousers, and walked slowly back toward the station. To Sergeant Love's eye, his superior appeared unchanged, calm, slightly abstracted, even a little sleepy. But the inspector's thoughts had quietly taken shape, like a score half-written, awaiting only the right notes to complete its melody. Inspector Purbright chose his moment with the same care one might devote to the timing of a cough in a crowded theatre. The following Tuesday evening presented itself as ideal. Choir practice at St. Saviour's, when nearly all of the central characters in his puzzle would be present under the same roof, absorbed in their own notions of duty and performance. The nave was draughty, the harmonies uncertain, and Mr. Dainty's gestures with his baton carried a suppressed ferocity that suggested he would happily beat time on the heads of his sopranos, if etiquette permitted. Purbright slipped in quietly, leaning against a pillar with the unobtrusiveness of one who had come merely to observe civic culture. During the mid-practice break, when cups of weak tea and biscuits were distributed with funereal efficiency, the inspector ambled towards the vestry door. He allowed himself a mild smile and remarked to no one in particular, "Curious, isn't it, how fires will start in the most inconvenient places, almost as though they choose their moment for effect." There was a polite laugh from Mrs. Price, an indifferent shrug from Dainty, and a nod of vague agreement from the bell-ringers. But Reverend Teal, standing with a biscuit half raised to his lips, froze. His wife beside him laid a hand on his sleeve a fraction too quickly, as though steadying him. Purbright went on mildly, "It interests me how little damage was done. Remarkable, really. Both occasions, only enough flame to create alarm, never enough to spread. One might almost think the fires were designed to be discovered." This time, silence greeted him. Even Sergeant Love, unused to such theatrical pauses, held his breath. Teal's wife cleared her throat and said rather too briskly, "Whoever did it, Inspector, surely meant to frighten us all." And succeed they did. Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, madam, though sometimes one finds the intended audience is not the whole parish, but a single person." He let the words hang, then busied himself with pouring a cup of tea, as though nothing of consequence had been said. Conversation resumed, but unevenly, like an orchestra stumbling back into tempo. A few singers exchanged glances, Mrs. Price whispered to a neighbour, and Reverend Teal, still pale, placed his untouched biscuit carefully on the saucer and excused himself early. When choir practice ended, Purbright walked slowly back to the station. Sergeant Love caught up, frowning. "Beg pardon, sir, but what exactly was the point of that? You didn't accuse anyone." "Accusation, Love," said Purbright gently, "is rarely as useful as suggestion. It is a subtler flame. One can observe who feels the heat." Love considered this, puzzled but respectful, while Purbright's expression remained serenely blank, as if he were thinking only of ducks at the pond. The following evening, in a quiet corner of the police station that smelled faintly of furniture polish and Sergeant Love's over-enthusiastic tea, Inspector Purbright gathered a modest company. He disliked public drama, preferring revelations to occur in places where the guilty could not appeal to an audience's sympathy or outrage. Thus it was that Mr. Dainty, Mrs. Price, Reverend Teal, and his wife sat in mismatched chairs around a long oak table, their expressions varying from irritation to dread. Purbright, hands folded loosely before him, began without flourish. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I summarize the affair in terms rather more mundane than divine retribution. The matter, you see, is not of theology at all, but of appearance, dignity, and a little household economy." Mrs. Price gave a prim sniff, as though unconvinced she could be lumped into so ordinary a narrative. Dainty folded his arms defensively. The Reverend Teal looked down at the table. "The first fire," Purbright continued, "was a small one in the vestry cupboard. Only hymn books, nothing more. A child might have caused it, except the hymnals had been rearranged, turned back to front, stacked with deliberate untidiness. Mr. Dainty, I believe, would never have permitted such disorder." Dainty straightened. "Certainly not." "Precisely. Which meant someone else had placed them so. Someone anxious to suggest carelessness, or someone planning a little blaze that could be swiftly contained." Purbright's gaze moved mildly to Reverend Teal. The curtain pinned hastily over the scorch marks reinforced that impression, a covering up not of danger, but of embarrassment. Teal swallowed, his hands tight on his knees. His wife, however, leaned forward. "And why should my husband be accused of such a thing? What possible motive?" "The second fire," Purbright went on calmly, "was in the organ loft. Torn psalms, set alight, where they would smoke and alarm but do no harm. Again, the gesture of a man who wished spectacle without consequence, a cry for attention, not destruction." There was a silence. At length Teal spoke in a thin, strained voice. I had no choice. The congregation has been dwindling. Collections falling. My appeals ignored. They say I am uninspiring. He looked up miserably. So, I thought, if there were an outrage, a threat, people would rally. They always do when danger is near. His wife closed her eyes. Alfred, she murmured, half in despair, half in weary recognition. Mrs. Price gasped theatrically. Mr. Dainty looked vindicated. Purbright inclined his head, his voice still gentle. You see, Sergeant, it was never hatred of psalms at all. It was the oldest motive in Flaxborough, the longing to appear indispensable. Teal said nothing. The faint sound of the station clock filled the room, ticking with the steady patience of truth, long delayed but quietly certain. The scandal, once whispered into the public domain, behaved with all the vigour of a late summer wasp, stinging everywhere, unwelcome at every table, yet oddly invigorating to the local chatter. Within a day of the police station gathering, news had travelled the length of Market Street, seeping from bakeries to butchers, from the queue at the post office to the queue at the bus stop. Reverend Teal was not formally charged. Purbright, with his habitual preference for proportion, judged that no jury could be persuaded to convict a clergyman whose most heinous act had been to scorch a few psalms in pursuit of a livelier collection plate. Still, the bishop was informed, and the prospect of a period of rest was discreetly mentioned. Mrs. Teal, it was said, had already written to a cousin in Devon. Mrs. Price, for her part, assumed a glow of retrospective insight, assuring her circle that she had known something was amiss with that curtain from the very first. Mr. Dainty carried himself with the puffed-up dignity of one who had defended his choir against adversity. Sergeant Love reported, with some bemusement, that even the milkman felt obliged to share an opinion on the matter, though it concerned neither milk nor doctrine. Flaxborough, having gorged itself on the excitement, settled back into its normal rhythms with the smug satisfaction of a town that had once more proved it was never as dull as outsiders assumed. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk the following Monday, wrote a few closing lines in a case file destined to be filed under miscellaneous. He paused, looked out at the rain dribbling steadily against the station window, and reflected that the need to be noticed was at least as potent a spur to mischief as greed or jealousy. Sergeant Love came in with a tray of tea and ginger biscuits, his expression hopeful. "Quiet week ahead, sir," Purbright permitted himself the faintest of smiles. "One may always hope, Love, though I fancy Flaxborough will see to it that our paperwork remains interesting." And with that he resumed his quiet labour, the town around him already humming back into its familiar pattern of errands, gossip, and discreetly concealed eccentricities.